In this video, I'll be performing the EC2 load balancing lab on my end so that you can follow along. I hope you did well, but if you ran into any roadblocks or if you just want to see how I did it, then feel free to watch this video. So the first goal we had was to create a launch configuration using a LAMP stack AMI. So of course, launch configurations are controlled through the EC2 dashboard. So I'm going to navigate to EC2. And then on the left side of the page, under autoscaling, I'm going to find launch configurations. And create launch configuration. Now recall that the only requirement for this lab was using a LAMP stack AMI, so everything else is optional. So let's find a LAMP stack AMI. And you'll find AMIs for just about everything in the AWS marketplace. The LAMP stack is a very popular web application stack, so I definitely expect to find some results here. And I do. In fact, it looks like there is some free tier eligible LAMP stack AMIs that we can use. And I'm going to use one that I'm familiar with already, and that's LAMP with PHP 7.1 by Bitnami. That one's free tier eligible, so I'll hit select here. And now for the instance type, of course I'm going to use something that's free tier eligible. So I'll choose T2 micro here and move on. Configure details. I'll give this the load balancing lab name. I'm not going to be accessing any other AWS services or anything with this instance, so I don't need to choose an IAM role. So I'll choose add storage here. And whatever it gives me for the default is absolutely fine because we don't have any requirements for the EBS size in this lab. So next, I'll hit configure security group. And this will happen sometimes with AMIs from the marketplace, is you'll get a suggested default security group. And that's what's happened here. So for the LAMP stack AMI, because the AMI serves a web application, it's suggesting that we give it SSH access, incoming HTTP access from anywhere, and HTTPS access from anywhere. So this looks great. The only thing I'm going to change is the SSH access. I'm going to change that from anywhere to my IP. I'll hit review. And of course, this is everything that we just configured, so I'll click Create Launch Configuration. And then I'll choose a key pair that I know I have on my local machine, and I'll create that launch configuration. And that's it. We have our launch configuration created. Now, we could just create an autoscaling group right now, but I do want to take a quick minute to close this out and look at that launch configuration. And everything looks great. Looks like it has the key name that it's supposed to, the instance type that it's supposed to, and we should be good to go. So, using this launch configuration, my next step is going to be to create an autoscaling group. I'll hit Create Autoscaling Group here at the top. And then I'm going to choose Launch Configuration and use an existing launch configuration. I'm going to find the one that I just created, which was Load Balancer Lab. I'll hit Next Step. And for the group name, I'll just give it something like Load Balancer Lab Group. And remember, one of the things we needed to do was make sure that this autoscaling group uses at least 2 instances so that later on in the lab, we can verify that the load balancer is serving to multiple instances. Next is for the network, we only have one, and that's the default VPC, so that's fine. And let's use a couple of subnets here. So because we're using 2 instances, I think for the purposes of this lab that 2 subnets is going to be just fine. So we'll leave it there. And we didn't have any requirements for advanced details for this autoscaling group, so we're going to skip these and go to scaling policies. Now, another thing that we didn't have as a requirement for this lab is using scaling policies. Now, if you wanted to, for experience, you definitely could scale it between 2 and a number greater than 2, depending on different scaling policies. But for now, 2 is fine. Under notifications, we don't need any notifications. If you wanted to, you could set up an SNS topic, but we're going to skip that. And I'll go to configure tags. And I do want instances in this autoscaling group to have some kind of name or identifier. So I'm going to give it the name of Load Balancer Lab, hit review, and create auto scaling group. And that's it. We can close it out. Right now it has 0 instances, but that is going to change as the group scales up to the minimum desired instances that it needs. In fact, I'm going to confirm that right now by going to instances, and I should see 2 instances being spun up right now. And there they are, 2 T2 micro instances that are getting created for that auto scaling group. The next step in this lab was to create both a load balancer and a target group, and there weren't any requirements beyond performing those 2 basic tasks, so any configuration is going to be up to us. So under load balancing on the left side of the page, I'm going to click load balancers, and I'm going to create a new load balancer. Now, one quick note, load balancers do charge you, and they are a little bit on the pricier side if you leave them running for a month. So definitely I recommend after this lab, shutting down any load balancer that you've created. And I'm going to choose the new application load balancer for HTTP and HTTPS because we didn't have a specific requirement for load balancer type. For the name, you guessed it, Load Balancer Lab. It's going to be internet facing because at the end of the lab, I want to test to make sure that it serves internet traffic to my 2 instances. And IPv4 will be just fine. We're not going to set up HTTPS or TLS for this lab, so leaving the load balancer protocol on HTTP over port 80 is going to be just fine. Recall that the 2 availability zones we decided to deploy our instances in the autoscaling group were these 2, US East 1E and US East 1F. So I'm going to select these 2 for now and go to Configure Security Settings. Of course, because we're not using secure, it's going to give us this error, and that's just fine. So next is Configure Security Groups. And here, we are going to give it the default security group that it recommends so that the load balancer can talk to any other resource in the default VPC and security group, but we're also going to give it the LAMP stack security group that was created for us earlier in the video. And that's because, if you'll recall, the LAMP stack security group gave access rules for port 80 and port 443. Of course, we only need port 80, but we're still going to use this security group, and we'll go to Configure Routing. Now, we haven't created a target group just yet for this lab, but that is one of the requirements, so we'll leave this on New Target Group, and we'll call it Load Balancing Target Group for short. Of course, the protocol and the port are going to stay at HTTP and 80. Target type over instance is just fine. And then because you're not required to configure any advanced health check settings for this lab, we're going to leave this alone as well, and we'll click Register Targets. And on this page, of course, we see a list of all of our instances in this region, and we do want to register 2 of these instances as targets in the target group. And of course, those are the 2 instances that got spun up in this lab. So let's add those to registered on port 80. And now we can see that both of these instances are running. They're registered under port 80, and they're part of the Load Balancer Lab target group. So let's review and create. There you go. Now, it can take a few minutes for the load balancer to fully propagate and become ready to route traffic. So I'm going to close out of here, and I'm going to pause this video for a brief moment while this finishes up. Alright, so the state of our load balancer has changed from provisioning to active. So this load balancer should be ready to serve traffic for us. So, with the right load balancer selected, on the description tab, let's grab the DNS name, place that in our clipboard, and now when we navigate to this in the browser, what we expect to see is a basic LAMP stack page. And there it is. So it looks like everything is working fine, and that was the last step in our lab, which was verify that we see a LAMP stack web app when we navigate to the load balancer's HTTP endpoint. So it looks like everything works great. So as a quick summary, what we did in this lab was we created a launch configuration using a LAMP stack AMI. We created an auto-scaling group with the launch configuration, We then created both a load balancer and a target group, and then we had the load balancer route internet traffic to the instances in that target group. Finally, we registered instances to the target group from the instances that were created in that autoscaling group. And now, whenever we navigate to our load balancer, it's alternating traffic to each of the two instances in our autoscaling group. And that'll wrap it up for this lab on EC2 load balancing. So if all of that makes sense, then feel free to move on.